Welcome back to another time-hopping and limb-chopping episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that dredges through the darkest caverns of the video game industry for the most ancient tomes of disastrous development cycles. And this week, we'll be taking a discerning eye to one of the most infamous 7th generation shooters that, despite a hell of a lot of hype, there were plans for novels, comics, and even movies, it very much failed to live up to that potential. The mind at the center of this maelstrom was, of course, the legendary Clive Barker, the master of horror who had already dipped his toe into the bloody waters of video games with 2001's Undying, but who then always seemed to struggle to get a follow-up project off the ground. And even when he eventually did, it wound up being featured on this very show. So put on your blackest shade of latex and load up your most monster-mauling military weaponry as I answer the question, what happened to Clive Barker's Jericho? Before we dig into the unholy story of the Firstborn, allow me to take a brief detour to the haunted streets of Kingsport, because Fulcrum Publishing and Mysterial Games' Stygian Outer Gods is about to launch into early access on April 14th. In this dark Lovecraftian tale, you play as an ex-anthropologist and former soldier, Jack, and are tasked with finding your missing father amongst the madness of a remote seaside town that's been plagued with twisted creatures and entities howling for your blood. As Jack, you'll need to survive both them and the frigid weather conditions, as well as collecting tools, resources, and weapons while solving various puzzles to get to the beating heart of the horror that's taken over the town. You'll also need to manage Jack's sanity and search for mysterious cards to improve his skills and gain new abilities, which you're going to need to survive the blood-soaked alleys of Kingsport, as well as the desolate beaches, dark forests, and underground mines that await you. So, if you're interested in taking a nerve-shattering journey into Stygian Outer Gods, hit the link in the description and pinned comment below and wishlist it before it launches on April 14th. Thanks once again to Fulcrum for sponsoring today's video, and now, without further ado, let's resume the hunt for the Firstborn. As mentioned earlier, Clive Barker's first foray into video games started with, well, Clive Barker's Undying, an ambitious PC-exclusive first-person shooter that, while falling quite short of becoming a commercial blockbuster, has since become a cult classic amongst horror aficionados. Fortunately, Mr. Barker always seemed to put more stock in the quality of the end product rather than how much money it could make, so he was still very much open to expanding his vision into video games as long as the idea had potential. The first half of the 2000s, however, didn't really present many new opportunities, but by 2005, things had finally started heating up, as he began putting several irons in the fire, with one being helped along by a little-known company by the name of Alchemic Productions. Alchemic had been co-founded by Brian Gomez and Rick Ernst, whom both met while developing Full Spectrum Warrior during their shared time at Pandemic Studios. Rick had previously worked on the likes of Neverwinter Nights and Arx Fatalis, while Gomez had more of a background in horror, and by happenstance isn't a stranger to our show, having worked on the cancelled and envelope-pushing for 1999 Thrill Kill, which you can learn about in this video here. Part of Alchemic's mission statement was to bridge the gap between creatives, such as writers or filmmakers, and to help them make the transition into video games, with one of their first clients being Clive Barker. In the recently released documentary Terabytes, which exhaustively chronicles the history of horror video games, Brian Gomez outlined the thinking behind teaming up with Mr. Barker. The goal had been, well, I wanted to create Red Storm. So Red Storm is Tom Clancy's brand for making Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six and such, and I thought Clive needed to have that in the horror space. We needed to have a go-to horror brand with this master of horror at the helm. And that's an interesting approach to take. If Tom Clancy, a name not every video game player was familiar with, especially in the early 2000s, could become a massive brand with multiple games under the same umbrella, why couldn't the same work with the creator of Hellraiser and Rawhead Rex? That was the thinking, at least, but of course, while ideas can be sound, it's always in the execution where they could easily fail. And thanks to some controlling partners, tight deadlines, and various creative differences, that dark fate would eventually fall upon Jericho. Just to make things clear, Alchemic Productions was not a publisher, but rather a middleman that was more on the creative side, which meant that the monetary muscle to get a game into stores had to be provided by somebody else. That somebody else wound up being Codemasters, a stalwart UK powerhouse that up until that point had published a lot of racing, Micro Machines, soccer, and of course the unforgettable adventures of the forgettable Dizzy.
Let's play Dizzy!
In the mid-2000s, though, lots of seasoned publishers were looking at the current trends and thought it was time to get with it, even though they forgot what it was. In Codemasters' case, they felt that the more mature-rated products they pushed out, the better, and thus greenlit several games such as Second Sight, Overlord, Turning Point, Fall of Liberty, and eventually the incredibly mundane Body Count. So, with that context, it made sense that the violent subject matter of Jericho would be a good match with Codemasters' new, much edgier mantra. So, all they needed then was to get a developer to do most of the heavy lifting. And that's where Mercury Steam finally entered the equation. Established in 2002 in Madrid, Spain by former members of Rebel Act Studios, Mercury Steam made a name for themselves right out the gate by developing the third-person sci-fi action game American McGee Presents Scrapland. With that then in their rear view, they started to think about their next project, and since Codemasters had previously published Rebel Act's Blade of Darkness in 2001, they were a natural choice to throw a pitch at. For more insight into the specific and narrow band of time, I spoke with former Mercury Steam staffer Raul Rubio Munares as to how exactly this all came about. I was managing director of Mercury at the time, so I was directly involved. After pitching 666 to Codemasters, an action horror project that never happened, they came back to us with the IP, and we worked on a pitch and a brief real-time video showcasing the concept. They liked it, and we moved forward. It was all unusually quick. And that's something that's gonna come up a few more times, I can tell you that for free. Tight deadlines and speed is what Mercury Steam had to work with, and since Codemasters were pulling the purse strings here, this was most likely at their behest. Altogether, Raul estimated the complete production time of Jericho was just 18 months, which is a very short turnaround for a next-gen squad-based shooter that contained multiple playable characters and various environments that were plucked throughout different time periods. Fortunately, the pre-production phase went smoothly, as Raul confirmed that the first-person shooter perspective and swapping between the different soldiers of Jericho's squad had already been established by Clive Barker and Brian Gomez, so it was just a matter of implementing it in-game. And even more fortunately, Mercury Steam had the tech to get this done as well, which is actually quite the rarity considering the amount of technical troubles I've covered in stories about 7th generation games before. The engine was proprietary, and it was called Fuel Engine at the time by its creator, Carlos. Today it is known as the Mercury Engine. Indeed, the engine had been used in American McGee Presents Scrapland, and it was inherited from Blade 2, the cancelled sequel to Severance Blade of Darkness. In turn, the engine started life in a tiny 3D action platformer named Alien Paranoia, and after that, it would power Castlevania Lords of Shadow. So while the technical side looked like it was all going to work out, the three-way relationship between Codemasters, Mercury Steam, and Alchemic wasn't going to continue very very much longer without encountering some bumps in the road. For Raul's part, he said that Mr. Barker was actually quite easy to work with, although he was somewhat elusive, only checking in and giving feedback rather sporadically. This might have been a factor as to why some elements of Jericho then started getting pushed into a specific and unagreed upon direction by management over at Codemasters. In fact, Raul explained that most of Clive's input had to first go through and be filtered by the publisher rather than going directly to Mercury Steam, including some key design elements to the members of Jericho Squad that Mr. Barker raised a certain amount of hell over. In the Terabytes doc, Brian Gomez recalled that since Clive Barker was a busy guy, working on multiple projects at once, a producer on the Codemasters side started inserting his own preferences into Jericho, which, would have been appropriate when it came to gameplay, an aspect that Clive always deferred to designers and producers. These preferences, though, revolved around character designs and backstory, which was supposed to be Alchemic and Barker's domain, so they were quite shocked the next time they got a development update and noticed some things had been altered. We had tried to create these characters that were very three-dimensional, humans like real people. When Codemasters got a hold of it and the producer assigned to it got a hold of it, he had kind of like an Asian fetish, if you will. The character of Billy, she had a completely different design, and then he ended up turning her into like this geisha, ninja, latex-clad sexy character, and Clive was like, what the fuck was that? That's not the Billy we had originally designed. Codemasters even got a pictorial of the characters, the female characters, into Playboy. Pictorials of video game characters, how you've always wanted to see them. And Clive was like, what the fuck, this isn't what we signed up to do. I think Clive was just exhausted at that point. He was disillusioned with how games work and was like, let's just get it out. And get it out they did, because, as said before, Mercury Steam had only been given 18 months to complete Jericho, and the only reason they were able to accomplish such a feat was because they had to simplify the game down to its core elements and use quite a bit of repetition along the way. Raul explained how they didn't really have the time to design more design into the game. You entered an area, killed some enemies, switched to the next character, pounded out some QTEs, wash, rinse, repeat. More time and resources would have helped. It's a miracle the game was made at all, much less in such a short period of time, and with a team half the size required for a similar single-player FPS. Those were the times, but honestly, repetition was painfully obvious since we had no chance of creating enough progression and variation. Also, all squad members playable simultaneously was a challenge that could have been avoided by making the player decide a party of 3 at certain checkpoints, with the other characters creating the illusion of splitting into other teams to expand the narrative and mission objectives. It's easy to say that now, but considering the circumstances, there was simply no room for anything due to the tight schedule and tiny budget. So when Jericho was released on the Xbox 360, PS3, and the PC in October of 2007, review outlets and magazines certainly took notice of these shortcomings. While there was praise heaped upon the graphics, the soundtrack, the horror atmosphere, and the overall story, critics took issue with the repetition, over-reliance on QTEs, issues with the character swapping, the short length, and very abrupt cliffhanger ending. Now, despite the poor reviews and the low sales, Jericho did and still has a small but passionate legion of fans, but most of them still take umbrage with that ending, or lack thereof. Turns out though that rather than this being caused by the short development life cycle, it was actually Mr. Barker who demanded this last-minute alteration to the finale of Jericho, which Raul was kind enough to break down for me. Clive requested to change the end of the game. Originally, the protagonist fused with the Firstborn and was unleashed on our plane of existence, together with the catastrophic and gruesome collapse of all the trapped time periods in one space. As you know, that's not the case in the released game. But that was not all. Clive needed us to change the whole last boss battle, killing 2 main playable and critical for gameplay characters, and find a solution in less than 60 days. So if that part feels rushed or it doesn't make much sense, that's Hollywood. Clive apologized in person for that though, as he felt it was really necessary for the story. This is usually not a big deal, but when your entire production is 1.5 years, well, you can imagine. Now, I know what you're shouting at your screen. Why did Mr. Barker do this? Well, it's because he originally wanted to tell the story of Jericho over the course of a whole-ass trilogy, evidenced by the dozens of interviews around that time where he proclaimed that the story of Jericho naturally set itself up for multiple video game chapters, and even had some interested parties sniffing around for the movie rights, so he wanted more of a cliffhanger ending for this first chapter than what he had originally written, which would have then increased interest in the inevitable sequel. Inevitability, though, sometimes isn't what it's cracked up to be, because the low sales and hellish critical reception sealed Jericho's fate of becoming the next big horror franchise, and Mr. Barker never collaborated with Codemasters again. For his part, Brian Gomez moved on from Alchemic to join Vatra Games for the development of Silent Hill Downpour, and yeah, I've covered that one right here. Raul founded Tequila Works in 2009 and developed such gems as Deadlight, The Sexy Brutale, and Rhyme, among others. As for Mr. Barker, well, he did indeed never return to video games, which isn't surprising when you consider the fact that he was dealing with a whole other troubled project during the early days of Jericho's development, which of course was the cancelled but nevertheless Grandma's Boy famous Demonic, a whole other weird-ass thing that I may have to tackle in the future. Thanks once again to Raul for taking the time to talk to me about today's subject. And if you know of any other delightfully devilish stories of video game or movie development, let me know in the comments below or enter the time-fractured temple that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!